Hello and welcome to the Choirlosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 279, Music Ed Podcasts from the Research Perspective with Theresa Hoover. Is a podcast real professional development? Is it a trustworthy source of information? What are the best ways to use one? What are the worst ways? Why do music educators even listen to shows like this and others? In this conversation, Theresa Hoover, a music educator and researcher who advocates for passing the baton to students through student-centered learning and agency and choice, through a book and podcast by the same name, Passing the Baton, discusses her findings on how music educators utilize podcasts for professional development, community, gathering information, teaching ideas, and even emotional support. She shares insights from her survey of music teachers for her PhD research, revealing their motivations for listening to podcasts, the connections they form, and the importance of authenticity in podcasting. Theresa and I also touch on the evolving landscape of music education podcasts, the challenges of commercialization, and the role of student ownership in music education. Theresa emphasizes the need for music educators to critically engage with all the podcast content and the potential for the podcast to serve as valuable professional development tools. But also it raises the question of legitimacy of each podcast to be a reliable source of information, and what happens to the trustworthiness of monetized podcasts like this one. Can you trust anything that you hear here? Well, I guess stick around, and the conundrum is, can you trust what the answer is? Tune in, listen all the way to the end, and head over to the Choirlosophers Facebook page and leave your thoughts there, or over to the Substack, which is becoming a more and more popular way for audience members and readers of the Choirlosophy blogs to have conversations there. Choir directors, music educators, show planners, you pour your heart into your music. Shouldn't your events get the same attention? That's where Ludus comes in. Sell tickets, promote your concerts, and fundraise with ease. Selling merchandise and concessions? Ludus Retail makes in-person sales effortless. Running choir camps or workshops? They have a classes feature that keeps registration simple, and when you need help, the live support team is ready to pop up with real answers from real people. The best part? It's completely free for organizations. Thousands of music programs already trust Ludus because great music deserves more than just a ticketing system. Ensemble trips can be more than just a performance. They can build community, inspire artistry, and give students a reason to stay invested. That's why I recommend Kaleidoscope Adventures. For more than 30 years, Kaleidoscope has helped student groups travel with purpose, combining performance opportunities with experiences that deepen musical understanding and create lifelong memories. They'll help you find the right destination, the right venue, and the right balance of music, education, and fun. And they manage the planning from start to finish so you can focus on your job as an educator. To explore options for your choir, visit mykatrip.com or find the link in the show notes. A big shout out goes to the producers and Inner Circle over at the Patreon page. These are folks that are really dedicated to keeping the lights on here at this show. Venture Studios, Chandler Smith, Brian Long, Michael Herron, Kyle Peterson, Steve and Kathy Kakachik, David Kowalczyk, Max Jackson, Angie Schilling, Rebecca Chalk, RJ McCracken, Michael Shimp, and Kyle Siddons. All right, everybody, I am here with Theresa Hoover. Theresa is a music educator, music education researcher, and we've been chatting for a little while because she's been doing some research about something that I obviously am going to find fascinating, which is how music educators are using podcasts. Now, of course, I'm going to start before I throw it to Theresa here. My first introduction to a music education podcast was all the way back in 2017 when I was invited to be on one, and I literally didn't know what a podcast was at that time. I was invited to be a guest, and I had to look up what a podcast was, and all the way to now where I'm doing it partially for a living. So I'm excited to hear what the research says on this. Theresa, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Why don't you start out by just telling us who you are? Tell us a little bit more about what you are, who you work with, and what kind of fills your day.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now, I'm actually a teaching instructor at East Carolina University, which is in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. I just began here back in the fall, and it's wonderful. I work with music education students, undergraduate and graduate level. I'm also in the process of finishing my PhD, which I've been working on. I spent the last 3 years in Arizona at Arizona State University doing that. And before that, I spent 19 years in the classroom, mostly teaching elementary and middle school band, but I have done it all. Elementary chorus, general music, high school, orchestra, guitar, you name it. But these days I spend my time with undergraduate music ed majors, and it's awesome.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, I'm glad you're here to talk about this topic. So let's go first to the topic itself. What led you to do this research in the first place? What sparked the interest for you to dig into how people are using music ed podcasts?
Yeah, well, kind of like you, I started listening to podcasts around 2017. Somebody just sent one to me and said, hey, you might be interested in this. And it was a topic that, he and I had discussed, and I listened and I went, this is amazing. It just kind of like fell down the rabbit hole of listening to podcasts. So I became very interested in it. Fast forward, in 2021, I ended up starting a podcast, which I still co-host to this day, and so it's something that I've been doing and just enjoying. And as I started transitioning into the role of like researcher when I was working on the PhD, I was really interested in how music teachers are continuing to learn stuff about music education. Besides, taking graduate classes and going to conferences, like what are the other things that music teachers are doing? And I started to notice that researchers were looking into lots of stuff about Facebook. They were really curious about how music teachers were using Facebook. And there was even a little bit about Twitter, but nobody was talking about podcasts. Yet I knew from my own experience, there were so many music ed podcasts out there. So it was like, what is this thing? Sure, everybody knows we got the Facebook music teacher groups, but what is this podcast thing? How are teachers using it? Why are music teachers listening? And just kind of what is it doing? So it really was just bringing all of those pieces of my world together into one thing.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. And it is interesting. So first of all, what is your show called?
My show is called Pass the Baton, Empowering All Music Students. So
okay, awesome.
It's a
Very
co-hosted show, mostly with interviews. We have a blast.
That's awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
Now, when you started researching this topic, what were some of the questions you were trying to answer specifically, I guess, and what were some of your methods for finding that out?
Yeah. So like one of the first things that I learned that you do with research is you figure out what everybody else is saying first before you can get any of your own ideas. What's everybody else saying? So I was reading studies about, a lot of them were why people listen to murder podcasts. There's actually research on that, which is really interesting. And then there were some people talking about just podcasts in general. And then there was one person or one group of researchers who were looking at education in general. Why people within the education field were listening. And that was kind of where I wanted to go. Like, why are music teachers listening to this? And I was kind of curious, like, are the reasons that music teachers listen the same as, say, a fourth grade classroom teacher? Are they the same as the high school history teacher? There's a little bit of that in the back of my mind too, because music teachers, we're special. We have unique things that come along with our profession. So I was kind of curious if they were going to be similar reasons for listening. The biggest thing I wanted to know is just, again, why are music teachers listening? What's happening? I was kind of curious to find out if newer teachers had similar motivations as opposed to like veteran teachers. I was curious if it was doing the same thing for rural versus urban and suburban, things like that. I was also trying to figure out if, what some of the benefits were. Like, okay, they're listening for this reason, but what are they getting out of it? So those are some of the questions that I was trying to answer. And I did it with a survey, and a survey that you very graciously were able to share with your listeners. So I'm sure many of the people listening were part of this research, which is actually really cool too.
Are you allowed to tell me, are you willing to tell me how many respondents you got?
Yeah. Let's see. My final number of we're going to say the sample that I was able to really use was 128, which for a survey we put out on Facebook and whatnot, it was a pretty good number. More people started the survey than that, but the requirements were they had to be in the classroom right now. They had to have listened to a podcast in the last year. There were a couple of things at the beginning where people maybe started but didn't finish.
I see.
The 128 was people who took the whole thing, and I was really able to use the data.
Got it. Okay. So what are some of the things that you found, any signals in the noise, so to speak, that you found in that survey and as you compiled the data that people might find interesting?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple things that were really fascinating. So the survey, again, started out with we call it Likert type, where people are clicking how much they agree with a statement. And that was based off of prior research. I basically just used their survey. And through that, I found out the biggest reasons music teachers listen to podcasts, or at least the ones who took this survey, is because they wanted the information. They used it as a source of info, which when we think about that makes a lot of sense. The other really big reason is because they found it a flexible tool. It was really convenient. It was really accessible. It was really easy to use. So those were the things that really motivated. The things that didn't motivate them as much were for entertainment purposes. They were not professionally motivated by other people telling them to listen to podcasts. So like one of the questions was, I listened to podcasts because my administrator suggested it. Yeah, that didn't get very many responses, which I had a feeling that was going to be the case, but you never know. And then social factors. That one was kind of in the middle. Like some people were listening for that sense of connection. They were listening to feel connected to the host or to the guests or things like that. The really fascinating thing, though, came when at the end of the survey, there were some open-ended questions like, were there any reasons that I didn't mention? And that's where people started talking about more emotional things. They listen to feel validated. They listen because it's a way to help them emotionally regulate as they're commuting to and from school. But everything in those open-ended, not everything, many things in the open-ended were emotional. And it was fascinating because none of the other research talked about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that might be based on my perspective of doing this show, might be part of that music teachers are special and weird thing you were saying it before. Because this is, I would say, probably one of the most common responses that I get from listeners of why they listen is related to not feeling alone. Because many of our colleagues, I'm fortunate that I teach in a school that has 7, 8 music teachers in the building all the time. But many of our colleagues are the music teacher, not only in the school, but it may be in the county. Yeah. And they would have to drive miles and miles to see and talk to the next choir teacher or next band teacher or whatever. And so I hear that a lot, actually, of like, I listen to your show because you're the only choir teacher who can talk to me while I'm driving to school, or because I can't ever go to the conventions. And so that's why they tune in. They're too far away. They don't have the funding, whatever. So that's really interesting. It's that sense of identity and connection.
Yeah. And it makes perfect sense, like you're saying, because it's that moment where you hear somebody talking about whatever happened in class. You go, oh yeah, that's happened to me. Like that's, yep, I've been there. And you just feel that connection. And I think that's even more than like saying you listen for social purposes. I think that emotional piece is big. So that was kind of just such a neat thing to see in the data that people really, they felt that kind of connection.
Yeah. Now, was any part of the survey related to things like how often do you listen? How long do you listen? Those types of things.
I didn't go into those kind of things just because I needed to make sure that this was something I could relatively, do within a dissertation period. Sure. However, the ideas for future researchers are all over the place. So I didn't look at that. One other thing I did look at, though, was how likely people were to continue listening to podcasts, which I thought was so. And the one thing that I found from that was that basically people who were listening because they wanted the information are very likely to continue listening and even recommending to other people. People who were just listening for entertainment were not likely to continue listening, which again, it makes sense, but it's neat to see the numbers say that.
Yeah, it does make sense because entertainment value fades when the novelty is gone, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. Like, you listen for a couple, you're like, all right, this is fun. Let's move on to the next thing. But people who are there for the information, they tend to stick. The other thing that was kind of interesting is like the motivations weren't any different between newer teachers and veteran teachers. The motivations also weren't really different between people in different like rural, urban, and suburban areas. So that was just kind of like, okay. I almost expected it to be a little bit different. Maybe the rural teachers valued the social piece more, but it was pretty even across the board.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I would have guessed a similar thing. Probably.
Yeah, but again, we also talked about the number of people, right? So we're just talking about the people who were in this survey. If we had been able to get 500 rural teachers and 500 urban, maybe the numbers would have come out differently. So we're just talking about those who, completed the survey.
It's a relatively small sample size, which brings up the next part of what you just said a second ago, which is those areas for future research are then, of course, really fascinating to consider, especially because the industry of music education podcasts has grown quite a bit.
Yes. Yeah.
When, like I mentioned, when I was invited on the Choir Ninja podcast back in 2017, and Ryan Guth was doing that show at the time, and he did it for about 4 years, 2015 to 2019 or so. And I had literally, I didn't know what podcasts were really, and I went on my laptop in my basement with no microphone, and had a Skype call that was recorded
Yeah.
from back in the day, and I enjoyed it. It was fun to do, and in my mind, I had no idea if anyone was actually going to listen to it, but it was like, it was something that was just it was just fun to have the conversation. And then, of course, the podcast industry writ large, not just music education, has, of course, exploded since that time, and is now a completely different landscape than it was in 2017. And so it's interesting because then when I started this show in 2019, there really wasn't much competition for me at that time. Like there just wasn't a whole lot. And when I say the competition, I just mean like to compete with people's time to listen to a show, because Ryan had stopped his, and all of this. And so but it has changed so much, and it just constantly changes. So what would be some of, like, what do you think about that? Like, what is your perspective from where you sit as a fellow podcaster?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really neat how many different shows are out there. And one of the fascinating things too is just, as one of the questions I asked people was, what do you listen to? Because I knew I was going to reach out to those hosts and ask them to share the survey. And just the wide variety of things that music teachers listen to is awesome. There's so much out there. And many people were talking about various music ed podcasts, ones that maybe were still recording new episodes, ones that had been discontinued for whatever reason. People were also listening to things that were like just music specific, but not music education. And there was a lot of that. And I just think that the amount that we can put out there is really fascinating, but it also leads to that next thing. And I mentioned this to you when we were talking, or we were preparing for this. If anybody can make a podcast, there's no, what's the word I'm looking for? There's nobody to say like, yes, you are qualified to have a podcast, right? Anybody can put it out there. So we do have to think a little bit about what kind of information music teachers are taking in, and do teachers are they thinking through, like, is what I'm listening to going to be good for my students, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the things, so for me, this is my way of thinking about that. Yes, in one sense, anybody can start a podcast, but it is very hard to do a podcast well.
That's very true.
In the 7 years that I've been doing this, I've watched them pop up and watch them go away. So it is not necessarily true or the case that anybody can start a successful podcast that a lot of people listen to and try to model their pedagogy after. So I'm not concerned personally about that. Like that's not something that would concern me, because it would take, I guess maybe the way I would think of it is that I think people are smarter than that. It really does need to be quality for it to be able to gain traction. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because like you said, how many podcasts do we see out there that have 2 or 3 episodes? And then the person realizes, oh, this is way more work than I thought, and it doesn't go anywhere. So that's a good point. Yeah, I guess with just the thinking through it, my rationale and my thought process behind that is just that knowing that the things that I do in my classroom are the things that work for me, but I recognize that might not work in every single setting. So teachers might have to just think through, okay, so this is what they're describing in that particular setting. How do I adapt that to meet the needs of my kids, right? Because we know that students in each school have all of their unique things that come with them, right? Different areas of the country, just different levels, there's so many different things. So my hope is just that teachers are able to think through that, and just not just because, oh, well, this person does it and they have a really successful podcast, it must work for me, but to be able to say, okay, here's how I can tweak that just a little bit to make sure that it's also going to be the most appropriate for my students. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It does. So, okay, so I've maybe a unique perspective on this too, simply because of the nature of this platform, which is unique in the music education world, partly because it's like my job, and that makes it unique. And so one of the ways that I try to mitigate, and I never have claimed to be perfect with the pedagogies that I present on the show. In fact, one of the things that I say a lot is, if you agree with everything you're hearing here, I worry for you. I wouldn't want you to. I would want you to be listening to everything you hear critically with here. And also, one of the things I like to say a lot too, though, is that I have to be very, very careful that I'm presenting everything as here's what works for me, but also here's what research says on that topic. Here is what data is showing me. Here's an expert who's also going to talk about that. And so I try to balance those things. And I think in a lot of ways it takes that, but at the same time, this goes back to the making a really good podcast is hard thing, is the amount of work that takes for me behind the microphone it's a lot.
Yeah.
And so if it weren't something I was treating as a job, I don't know that I would be able to keep up with all of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I think the challenge of doing this kind of thing well, right? Is being able to think about it in all of those different ways. And yeah, it's a lot. Like I am so thankful that I have a co-host because that way we can split the work and we, if it was a solo effort, it would be even more challenging. So so that's just one of the things that I think about, as teachers are listening, is just hoping, and because we don't know how they're thinking through, but hopefully they're thinking through it with that critical lens of like, this is how I'm going to adapt this to work in my situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Whether you've newly discovered the show or you're a longtime listener, I would like to encourage you to become a paid subscriber, either on Patreon or Substack. Each works as a way for you to financially support this show and has different pros and cons, but in both subscription locations, you'll have access to my Google Drive, behind-the-scenes episodes, a direct line of communication to me that I will prioritize, and more importantly, it makes sure that I can keep doing this show forever. Those supporters are the reason that I'm able to do this show as a job and sustain it and treat it like a content generation machine for your benefit. So I would encourage you to head over there to either patreon.com/Coralosophy or coralosophy.substack.com and become a paid subscriber today. Yeah. Yeah, no, it is an interesting thing. And I also think that, kind of going back to your original query about whether or not a person is qualified to have a podcast, like I said, I'm not really concerned about that, because I think anybody who wants to speak about what they want to speak about should. And I think that's a wonderful thing about the technology.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, I would then also ask, who is then qualified to say that person's not qualified?
Right.
So
exactly.
And which is where, that's where my concern would come in for any kind of, attempt to delegitimize somebody trying to do this because they don't have this qualification or that qualification. I think in a lot of ways, what makes a good show in any field, not just music education, is that you feel like you're hearing somebody speak authentically from their own personal experience, and you don't get the sense that person is like putting on a performance for you. And I think those are, if you look across the podcasting world of all subjects, those are the ones that tend to do the most well, do the best.
Yeah.
Thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, that's a good way to think about it. And when I was saying qualified, it was just I'm not thinking that we should have any kind of we should not have a bar like you must pass these tests before you can have a podcast.
Board.
That's not no. No, because you're right. That is part of the beauty of it, is that people can share. And we have to remember that that's what it is. It's the authenticity of people being able to share their stories. And I think that's really valuable.
Right. Yeah. So one thing we could do, Theresa, which I think would be really fun, is if you put your researcher hat back on.
Yeah.
And treat me like a case study. What things about being, doing podcasts and that you mull over, especially as you've reflected on your research, that some of those future research questions that you might have for, and it would, I guess, just call me like the industry grandpa, I guess, and thinking about the things that you're thinking about and how they might interact with what I do here and what you do on your show.
Absolutely. So one thing that it almost kind of relates to what we were just talking about. One thing that that came up in the research is one of the specific questions was people responded to the statement, I listen to podcasts as a form of professional development. Yeah. And they used that word PD. Mm-hmm. And that's a hot topic word in research. In music education research is PD. So a lot of people said that they viewed their podcast listening as PD, and they mentioned that in open-ended questions too. So if music teachers are thinking of it as PD, if they're listening to your show and they're like, yep, this is PD, should it count? Should they get credit for it? Should they get like hours? How do we as podcast hosts or, as school administrators or whoever, how do we grapple with that idea that a lot of music teachers are feeling like they're getting their professional development from a podcast?
Yeah. That's a great question. Of course, that's a big part of my business model here, is providing PD. And so I would say yes. However, I wouldn't say that any podcast that you listen to ever should be necessarily considered PD. Then my response would be to school district person who's deciding if it counts or whatever, is how would you evaluate whether or not any PD counts? In other words, does it suddenly become more or less legitimate because it's a person talking on the internet, or are we evaluating the content itself? In other words, if you've got a group of teachers in your district, and this core philosophy has been used as a PD in fact, it's been choral methods classes, and universities all over the country are using this show for that reason. And so I would then say it's based on whether or not the show is presented in a way that would qualify for PD if it were live in person. Because if it's not, for example, some of the episodes I do on my show would not qualify as PD. I wouldn't put them out there as PD. It's just two people talking about, whatever topic of the day is interesting to me at that time. And my show's weekly, so I'm talking about all kinds of stuff. But if I'm doing a pedagogy episode with, an expert pedagogue from some place who's incredible, or if I'm doing my literacy series, those types of things are well researched, well presented. I'm being hired to present those very same PDs in person. So why not take the podcast for those teachers who can't afford to bring me out there on a plane, those types of things. So I think that would be my way of answering it, as I wouldn't say just any podcast, but I would say if it would qualify in person, then the podcast is a great substitute. So then who would make the determination, I guess, would be the question. School districts have their own way of determining that. That's how I would think of it. Like, this show would qualify for some teachers and not others, depending on how their school districts treat that. And I don't know that there's a better way to handle that. Do you view your podcasting as PD for you? Oh my goodness, yes. Me too. Absolutely. In fact, that is probably one of the hardest things for me to explain to people who don't understand what kind of work goes into doing this. Because, for example, I had a person reach out not too long ago. This person probably is listening, and asked me to share some of my current favorite resources for their PD. And I said, I know this is going to sound terrible, but I'm so busy making my show. The show is my resource, because every week I'm talking to some super, super smart person from some various area of expertise within our profession, all these little niches of our profession that I would never be able to just be an expert on all these things all by myself. And I get to research in preparation for that conversation. And then I get to pick that person's brain for an hour. And then I get to field the questions that come on social media afterwards. I get to study more topics and get paid for it than anybody. And so yes, like my professional development isn't happening each week as I prepare for these things. And my kids at school have kind of a running joke now for many, many years, which like I'm going to come into class and I'm going to try something brand new that they have never had happen before. Mr. Muntz did a podcast again, like they can tell that I've just learned something new that I'm excited about trying or whatever. And many things I keep and many things I discard, but it is constant professional development. That's a great question. Do you feel that way too for yours? Totally. And I mean, I joke that the podcast is like a selfish endeavor because I get to talk to really cool people who I want to meet, because it's such an incredible, and like you said, almost every episode, there's something that I take and that I implement, and then maybe I try it and then I tweak it and then I experiment with it. But there's so many things that I learn by hosting. I remember a couple years ago, I think my co-host tried to get PD credit for it and her district said no. She was like, come on. Do you have any idea what we're doing here? It's such a good, And then go ahead. No, I was going to say that I think also some school districts have different types of professional development goals for the year. Yes. And I know one of the things that I've come across with listeners is that I've been told things like, "Ooh, I'm really excited. Your podcast will qualify this year as one of my professional development tools because every year they come out with a new plan for their district, like a professional development plan. And then, sometimes it'll list, pick one podcast and read one book and, whatever. And then suddenly that podcast shows up and then they're like, I already listened to this and they can use it as an example. And then some years it probably doesn't count. And, those things, I think it would be smart for school districts in general to expand that umbrella because in a lot of ways, there isn't a lot of substantive difference, like I said, between the live presentation, because most teachers don't ask questions anyway. They just sit in the back and listen. So it's not a whole lot different than what a podcast is, plus not a whole lot different than, say, a webinar or, other types of things. The line is getting blurry with how multimedia this technology
Yeah.
is now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting when you think about it. Like I listen to my podcasts when I'm walking my dog or driving to work or things like that, which is obviously different than me sitting in a room with people. But like you said, I might be in the back of the room. I might be checking my email. I might be making my grocery list, all of those things. So it's an interesting line. This popped into my head as you were talking. The other thing I'm kind of curious about is like the motivations for the podcast host as well. So obviously we both view it as a form of PD, but are the motivations similar? And then this kind of goes beyond just you and I, but how is it different for, say, the big companies that have podcasts versus the people who are in the trenches in the classrooms hosting them? Like, what are the differences in those kind of podcast hosts and their motivations, which is always an interesting topic when you bring in. I know, but it's like, this is the stuff I think about, right?
Yeah. See, I love this question because I can answer it very simply, but in my way, which is very dry and sarcastic. So the difference between a show like this, for example, and a show that is like the company's podcast is that people listen to this show. People don't listen to company podcasts, and that data is, you can seek that. And I think I know why. In fact, it's been one of my trade secrets, I guess, but it's not a secret, is people don't like to listen to infomercials. Like if it's a branded company podcast, like I'm just going to name a music company, no shade, because I do things with GIA here, but like if it was the GI company podcast and they want somebody to tune in and listen to how great the music is that they publish, nobody cares, and nobody wants to be sold something. And so one of the things that I deal with regularly is that I get people who reach out wanting to come on the show to sell their product. And I have to respond. Sometimes it makes people really mad. I respond that I don't do infomercials. If there is a product that you'd like to plug at the end of the episode, that's fine. But we're going to, like, if you're going to come on the show, we're going to talk about something real, like something that matters, something that helps me get to know you, helps the audience get to know you, or what you do and why you do it and how you do it. And then if you've got a book to sell, then we'll...
Yeah.
But if it's the whole podcast about the book, no, because nobody wants to. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And we feel the same way. It's, if you're going to come and like provide value to the listeners, that's perfect. And yes, please plug your book at the end. But the substance of the episode needs to be valuable, right?
Right.
As we
and
said,
of course, that we didn't invent that concept. That's like even the late night talk shows, Colbert and Dave Letterman and all those. Like those people come on those shows to promote a movie or to promote or whatever. But they always have some kind of conversation first, and then that's what draws people in. They want to feel like they're meeting the celebrity or whoever, and then they say, oh, and by the way, here's a book I wrote, and oh, by the way, go see this in theaters. And I think that exists in podcasting as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point to think about how they're framing it. Are they just selling their thing, or are they really trying to make connections?
Yeah. Now, of course, I'm going to jump to something you sent in an email because I think it's related. Because you also said, you asked, one of your bullet points is, should we think differently about podcasts that are monetized, sponsored by a company, advertisements, etc., which are not big, and that's not quite the same thing as an industry podcast or a company podcast. So what leads you to that thinking?
Yeah, I guess that, so we were talking before about like why we do this, right? And you and I both agreed, like, we do it because of how much we learn from it and how much we love that process. But somebody who may be thinking more from a monetary perspective, or like the sponsors, you think that's different? Do we think about those differently?
I think a lot of people do. A lot of people do. I know that for me, one of the things that I get kind of accused of all the time is creating clickbait for financial gain. That is what people say that I'm doing. In reality, most people, I don't think, realize what it takes to generate the kinds of listenership that would allow someone to sell ads. Like in the podcast, like we're talking about it's thousands and thousands of downloads weekly, monthly, and it has to be pretty consistent, or else you're not going to sell ads. And so one of the things, though, that I try to do to mitigate concerns that somebody might think, because usually those are concerns from people that don't actually listen to my show. That's what I've discovered. They're just like, they see things. But is that for example, if somebody's going to come on and be an advertiser here, the very first conversation I have with them is under no circumstances at all ever will you have editorial control over what happens on the show. In other words, if that's going to be an issue, if you're going to be concerned about what I say or when I say or who I talk to or when I talk to, then this is not going to work. And so you have to be okay with that, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to protect the authenticity that made the show popular in the first place.
Yes.
And if I don't lead with that, then I'm also not being authentic with the advertiser, because I don't want to promise them something that I can't deliver on. So that's how I think about it. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think and you said the authenticity word again, right? I think that's been the key through a lot of this, is that you have to figure out how to maintain that. And I guess the thing is we don't know about other podcasts that they are still holding that. And I think part of my reason for thinking about this is just like influencer culture. Right? Anybody on social media has seen that and has seen the people who are, that is the goal. The goal is to have that influencer status, as opposed to necessarily putting out the best music education content. I don't think we see that in podcasts as much yet. Do you notice that in the podcasting world?
Well, so these are great questions, and I'm really glad you're here, Theresa, because this is interesting for me. In a lot of ways, it's kind of cathartic to have this conversation, because again, for the way that I operate this show, there is influencer status that I've kind of had to try to achieve to get the kind of numbers that I do, which is where the clickbait accusations come from. But the problem is folks fail to sometimes recognize the point. The point of lots of social media activity is to get you to come listen to the podcast. Right. So the way I think of it is, like, if I get 200,000 views on a video of me teaching from a clip from a show of a pedagogical demonstration that's 90 seconds long, anybody is going to watch that and be able to pick apart a bunch of holes in the pedagogy there, because that just wasn't a very thorough demonstration. It's 90 seconds. But the whole demonstration is on the is on the show.
Right.
And it's like an hour long. And if you want to go to it there, you can. But I also know, and I think I'm just okay with it. I'm okay with the idea that not everyone's going to come to the show. Some people are just going to watch the 90-second clip and go, oh, he's just throwing out clickbait. And I was like, well, but of the 200,000 people that watch that video, if 200 come and listen to the show, then I've done my job. And if people want to gripe online, then they can gripe online. So that's kind of how I think of it, as like, I'm willing to play the influencer game so that I can get people to come to the substance, which is the actual conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, that seems to be the more authentic way to do it. There are other people in other areas, whether music ed or not, that have different ideas about influencer culture, right? So that's just something we have to kind of be aware of. And I think we have to be aware of that just in all facets of things that are online, not just this podcasting world.
No, you're exactly right. Yeah, you're exactly right. And I wonder too if, and I think this could be another example of music education is just unique in a few ways that make. So for example, I can't imagine a scenario where I could put a video out, like a clip of a show, that would get so many views and clicks and everything else that I am suddenly making my living from the clicks and the clicks.
Yeah.
Like, that's not how it works for me. Like, Joe Rogan can do that, but but I can't do that. Like that, we're not talking about millions and millions of clicks and views. I actually have coined a term up for this. I sometimes have videos that go viral. That's the term that I've coined. I won't ever have a video go viral. Like, there's not enough people who are interested in this content and the music education content. It's too niche. Yeah. And so you do kind of have to just try to go onto social media and drag as many people as you can over to the actual content, and that's where the real conversation happens.
Right. And that's where you're providing the value to people. You're not just saying, go to my Teachers Pay Teachers store and buy a worksheet, that's right, whatever it is. You're saying, come listen to my podcast. That's where you're going to gain the real info.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So that's exactly right. And I think I wouldn't say there's anything wrong per se with creating teacher materials for sale. My concern with it is that, it should also include the demonstrations. It should also include the conversation about why it works. It shouldn't just be like, click and download and buy this. I've always felt like that is just so incomplete.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's one of the benefits that podcasts afford, right? Because we can have the conversation. We can talk about, here's what worked. Hey, here's the first time I tried it. Here's what didn't work, right? Yeah. And then here's how I adapted it the second time. We can have the conversation on a podcast to get deep into those things. So even if we are selling a worksheet or whatever, we're giving them all the rest of that value.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. And I think, only in a podcasting format can an audience member really pick up on some of the nuances and the humanity of the PD provider in this case, or the person, the expert talking about something or whatever, because everything else just becomes sometimes just like a downloadable PDF, and that's not, there's no humanity there. And there's also no opportunities to kind of hear the other sides of the coin with a lot of ideas you try. Here's a thing that could work in this scenario, but if I was in this scenario, I don't know if I would do it that way. That kind of thing is so important to what we do, because everybody teaches in such wildly different situations.
But I think that also, that ties back to that emotional piece that we were talking about before. You're not going to get that reading a blog post or downloading a PDF or any of that. The way that with podcasting, we have the voice. It automatically makes it a more intimate conversation, right? And sometimes you feel like you're part of the conversation with the host, that we can have that emotional connection. In a lot of media things, they talk about the idea of parasocial relationships, which is the relationship that it's kind of a one-sided relationship that someone forms with a media personality. Yeah. Originally, they talked about it a lot with soap operas, how people would become emotionally attached and feel like they had an emotional relationship with someone on a soap opera. And that's becoming a thing in the podcasting world too, is that people form these relationships. And I think about it, I'm like, because that person, he's on every commute that I have. He's on my drive every day. Of course we're friends, and it's because of that intimate nature of the voice and hearing someone speak.
Yeah. Now, it's funny that you bring that up. You may or may not have seen it, but we're actually having this conversation right now on the 7th birthday of this show. So
that's exciting.
Yeah, so this show was started on February 19th, 2019. And so on my Substack and on the show, I did an episode that just dropped out today of reflecting on some of these very things, actually, of just the things that I've experienced kind of operating in this very strange place within our profession that 10 years ago didn't exist. This is something that I was never taught how to do in undergrad. How to have a music ed podcast was not one of the classes that they offered at the conservatory in 1997. That was just not one of the things. And so I'm kind of navigating all of these things, on my own, and because there isn't a network of us, for example. There isn't a professional organization of music ed podcasters. Maybe 20 years from now there might be, and maybe there should be. Yeah, in fact, I started a Facebook page several years back and tried to get a network going. Didn't really go anywhere. I'm not sure that a lot of us really, when I say us, just people who are doing this, really want to collaborate, because it might feel competitive to them. I've always been I want to collaborate. I'll reach out to new podcasts if I see them come across my feed, and hey, do you want to do a joint episode, and that kind of thing. And so it's interesting, because I think maybe 20 years from now there could be, and maybe there should be some type of a network or maybe even a class that people could take, that kind of thing.
It's funny you say that. I'm actually teaching a class right now.
Oh, well, look at you.
Yeah. So Vandercook
Tell us about
University.
That.
Yeah, so Vandercook College of Music, they do online classes for music teachers. So I'm teaching a class. It's called Podcasting for Music Educators. And throughout the class, people are going to be learning, they're learning about what podcasting looks like in music ed, and then they will start their own podcasts. So we are currently sitting in week 2. So ask me again in a couple of weeks. But it's been blast.
Does that include so I'm assuming that would include kind of the basics of the technology too, just what to get, how to set it up, that kind of thing? Yeah,
a little bit. It's obviously very dependent on where people are, right? So one of the things that I'm doing right now is just figuring out who knows what, who has recorded audio in any case before, who has. And then from there, it'll be the basics of the tech, how to use it. And then just also how to think through, what do you want your story to be about, right? Do you want to be talking, and who's your audience? It could be a music ed podcast that other music teachers are going to listen to. Maybe it's a podcast for your students. Maybe you're trying to teach your students things, right? Because that's another great way that we can use this medium. Yeah. Or maybe it's a podcast as a form of advocacy to share with the community all of the cool things that are going on in your program. So people have to decide, what avenue they want to take. It'll be fun.
Yeah, I've toyed with that idea over the years of what would it be like to start a podcast of at school, like with
Yeah.
about school related things, choir music things, band, orchestra. Like I could imagine like a whole music department podcast
Yeah. Yeah.
where they get to share with parents some of the things that are cool that are happening on a day-to-day basis that they would never see at a concert because you parents show
Exactly.
up, once a quarter for the concert. They don't see and hear about necessarily all the cool things that are happening during the day.
Yeah. And to have the opportunity for the students to share that with their own voice and their own
Yeah.
words could be really neat.
Yeah, that'd be incredible.
Yeah.
Well, Theresa, okay, so let's do one more thing. I'm going to officially grab the mic back now, and I want to hear a little bit more about your experience as a podcaster, and the things that I'm specifically interested in are because I shared several things already, but like the things that make you the most excited to do an episode. Like, so for example, are there stories that come to mind or episodes that come to mind that you were just really excited to have that conversation, and why?
Well, yeah. So we said before, it's this opportunity to talk to people who I admire, and that's been incredible. Like I think still one of my, and I hate to say this, I hate to say favorite because there's so many wonderful. But as a band person, we had the opportunity to interview Jody Blackshaw. She is incredible, just one of the kindest, just incredible people. So that was like a bucket list kind of interview for me. But then at the same time, we will interview somebody who maybe they reached out to me and I said, well, okay, let's try it. And you learn so many fascinating things from people that you wouldn't have otherwise encountered. We had a gentleman on recently. His name's Merlin Thompson. I'm so happy that he contacted me last year. We've actually had him on twice now. He's a piano teacher, lives in Canada, has been teaching longer than I've been alive. I can't remember his exact number of years, but he's been teaching and just hearing his perspectives and how open he is to trying new things and thinking about the needs of the students. Like, it's fascinating. Never would have come across him, but he found our podcast and said, hey, I want to share my story. And just, doing the little bit of research, I think this could work. And sure enough. So for me, the things that get me excited are those kind of conversations. When you just sit, you think you know something about someone and then you sit down and have the conversation and you learn so much more. And it just, it's such a great feeling. The other thing I love is, if I'm at a conference and someone goes, hey, I listened to your podcast. I loved this episode. I'm like, yes. You get that moment of meeting somebody who listens, somebody who has me on during their commute, and having those conversations is so fun too. So I love it.
Yeah, I love the you don't look like what I thought you would look like from what you sound like. So things like that. People imagine you, especially if they're not watching the video version. Mm-hmm. They imagine different versions of you, which is interesting and funny. So what about how would you describe your podcasting or content creation ethos? In other words, what is, you've talked about what you get out of it, which is these great conversations, but what is it that you're hoping to achieve, and what are you hoping that your audience gets out of it? Those are kind of two separate questions, I guess.
So our podcast is focused on student ownership, this idea of how we can give a little bit more ownership to the kids, so that with the idea of this true lifelong musicianship and whatever that can look like. Mm-hmm. So our goal for the audience is that people are just finding ways that they can try things a little differently in their classroom. When I was in public school, it was very, very teacher directed, and that worked great for me. We did what we were told, we played great music, all of that. But we're trying to encourage people just to think a little bit more about how the students can have a bit more of that ownership. So they're taking a little bit more responsibility, picking repertoire, helping to rehearse the pieces, just doing things that are going to help them in that lifelong process of music making. So ideally, again, the listeners are just finding tidbits, things that they can try, things that they can do in their classroom, ways that they can maybe even just think about things a little bit differently to achieve some great things. So when we think about our guests, that's what we're looking for. People who have taken those chances in the classroom, who've tried something different, and they're sharing how it's gone. Again, it's always so nice having people tell the story, because you hear well, I first tried it this way, and then I tried it this way, and you get to hear that whole thing, as opposed to just like, go do this and it works, right? You get to hear the progression. You get to hear where it started, where it's been, and what they hope to try next. So it's just a lot of food for thought.
So I have a question about that then, for that goal for you for your show. Yeah. So in band, because you're a band person, I'm a choir person. Mm-hmm. I was in band, but that is also true of almost every choir person ever.
And I was in choir.
That we were once in band, and or orchestra or played piano. So in this idea of passing the baton, of empowering the students more than is
Yeah.
maybe traditional or is more than is our generation, for example, might have been
Yeah.
in band or choir or whatever. Do you find, or would you find, that, say, beginning level fifth grade band might not quite be the same in that project as, say, a high school band that already knows how to play? In other words, do you see like a distinction between kind of student-centered models of learning for a kid who's already established some skills that they can now take on their own and do something, do music, be a musicer, versus a kid who's like, where do I put my fingers? Like, and how,
Right.
does that make sense of how maybe the
Oh, yeah.
student-centeredness wouldn't always be the same in all those situations?
Yeah, it's definitely not going to look the same. And if you try to make it, I think it's going to be a big problem. But you can still have elements of it, right? It's just
Sure.
the little things. Like when I was teaching beginning band, yeah, there's one way to hold the trumpet. There is one way to form the clarinet embouchure. We're not going to, right? And that was something that I made sure that the students knew. But how quickly could we then get them into like just kind of leading the class in reminding everybody how to put the clarinet together? Just little things like that. Or maybe once we've all learned, our first breathing exercise, hey, would you like to lead it today? And that student stands up and gets to count. And just so you do the really little things when they're at that stage. But that's because that's what's developmentally appropriate. Right. That's the kind of stuff that's going to make the most sense. And then as they get older, as you work with the students longer, then you can start doing more things. There's no reason you can't say to a fifth grade class, like, hey, what did you think about how that sounded? Do you think, how could we make that phrase more interesting? Could we make it louder? And then you can start to have those conversations when they're young, but it just has to be developmentally appropriate. And it's,
that's a good point. That's a good point. And thank you for explaining it that way. I think sometimes, especially younger teachers, because right now the student-based or student-centered and inquiry-based learning models are the trend in a lot of school districts, and a lot of school districts are going that way. And that has always been my concern, because my entire pedagogy is based on student leadership, student-led sectionals, based on an ethos of I want to hand you a piece of music and walk away, and you're just going to learn it. You don't need me to do that, but I have to teach those things to them first. Like if I did that on the first day of school of ninth grade for my kids, it would be over.
Yeah.
They wouldn't know what to do. So I'm glad that you clarified that, because I think that needs to be clarified for young teachers, especially more.
Yeah. Well, and we also have, and I'm glad that you said ninth grade, right? Because I think some people also say, well, they're older, they can do it. If they've never done it before, no, they can't. You still have to, that's where the scaffolding comes in, right? The scaffolding. Yes, they might be more musically advanced. They might be, there's all those kinds of things that we can take into effect, but you still have to think about, they haven't learned these skills yet. For a lot of kids, school is still following directions. Yeah. So we can't assume that they're going to know how to lead and take those steps if we haven't given them the opportunities to learn. That's why I kind of advocate for what can we do when they're younger, just to give them those little things, like to give them those opportunities to make choices for themselves and to think musically. And what's kind of fun with the younger ones too, is they also don't know what the right answer is supposed to be. So like, how the older students, they're always looking for like, they know what they think, that they want the right answer. You can ask young kids like, hey, how do you think we should phrase this? And they might say something completely bizarre, which is kind of fun. Like, oh, you think we should get louder there? Let's try it, right? And then you do it and everybody makes a face, but because they don't know that might not be what you're supposed to do. But who cares? It's music, right? Music is...
Well, and then they discover it. And that's the great part about those types of opportunities, is that then they figure out that they just made a silly phrasing suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's okay.
Without you having to be the one that tells them. And like they discovered it on their own. Oh, but wouldn't it be so much better if we crescendoed here instead? Yes. And then of course you're smiling and nodding because you knew the whole time.
Right. But at the same
you're
time,
letting them discover it.
What are we getting out of that, doing it every time? Oh, we're still getting reps. We're still getting reps on that phrase, whether we do it different dynamically every way. They're still playing it multiple times, which is also a benefit. And they're getting to think about it musically instead of me just saying, we must crescendo here because I said so.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And of course, all those things I think are also in a balance because we have limited class time.
Of course.
We could let kids argue about the shape of the phrase all hour, and then we could never get the concert ready. And so sometimes, and that's where I think the conductor does still have some some of that old traditional responsibility, which is if there's 10 different phrases in the room, we need to decide. You could vote, but even that takes time. And sometimes, like, you got to make decisions and make the rehearsal go. Yeah. And so I think really what matters, and I want to see if this maybe could be our final little discussion here, is what matters is not necessarily that every single decision is being made by students to overturn some kind of a hierarchy. What matters is that kids are being taught that their input matters, and also that they are there to be a part of the creative engine that is the ensemble. That they are not the whole engine, but neither am I, the conductor. I'm not the whole engine either. I'm a part of it. I've got my conductor hat or whatever, but you're part of that creative engine too. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's that it's not all coming from me, that we are a team. Yeah. We're going to all work through this, and that you are going to have opportunities to think musically, right? To be a musician and not just a rehearsal robot who knows how to push down the right buttons at the right time, right? Yeah. So we want you to be able to think about it musically, so that when you do have the opportunity to not have a conductor, you can still make music without me, right? Because that's what, I imagine that's what all of us want. Whenever they leave us, we want the music to keep happening. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'll reveal a little bit of my cynicism here on the way out. I don't think that all of us want that, actually. I think there are conductors and teachers that really do want to be the center of everything. And it doesn't mean that they don't care about their students. And I don't think we should get those two things mixed up. I do think oftentimes it does come from a good place, because I am such a good conductor that if I control every detail, then I will be giving them this amazing experience. And because I care about them, that's what I'm. So it's not like a good person, bad person thing. It's like we don't all share that philosophy of, I would really like to be able to get out of the way and have this be all about what they're doing.
Yeah. And I think some people say that they want kids to be lifelong musicians, they go about it in the way that you're describing, which is kind of counterintuitive, right?
Controlling every aspect. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then as soon as you're not there, then yeah.
So I do share your cynicism in that. And and I think that's also why that I feel like that's part of why we do our podcast, is because we want people to just to think, right? Yeah. Now, of course, I think most of our listeners already do think the way we do, but hopefully we can help other people just to think about the little things. It doesn't have to be all of us. And it's hard, right? We're musicians. We do this job because we are musicians, and a lot of us get a lot of musical value out of it. But we have to remember that they're also developing musicians too, our students.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I'm working on a new presentation right now that I've not given before, and it's going to be an episodes or a series of episodes on the show eventually. But it's just called "Give Them Tools and Let Them Build," and I've been kind of codifying that into an actual pedagogy that I could present. It's just been something I've randomly been talking about smatterings of over the years, but I'm turning it into something a little bit more concrete. I'm excited about that, but sounds like it has a lot of similar themes to what you're presenting. But for the choir side of things, mine's in the choir context. But this has been a fun conversation, Theresa. Before we sign off, though, tell people, if you can, is there a way for them to interact with your research still, or is it the kind of like fancy only in a journal kind of thing? Do you have it published online?
So that's all a not yet. I don't know when exactly this is going to be airing. On March 20th, I will officially defend this thing, and then you'll be calling me Dr. Hoover. And then at that point, I'm going to be writing it up. My goal is that I want this research to be accessible to people. So that means I'm going to likely have a blog post. I'll probably have another podcast episode about it. Yes, it'll hopefully go into a journal as well, but I want it to be very accessible. So probably the easiest way is just to either follow me on social media or my website, and then to keep updated that way. Because I don't want this to live in the ivory tower. This needs to be out there because it's music teachers who helped create it, and let's get them to be able to see it.
That's great. And then how can we find your podcast?
So the podcast is called Pass the Baton, Empowering All Music Students. You can find it on any of the platforms. We're also on YouTube. Pass the Baton has both an Instagram and a Facebook page as well. You can find me on Instagram is Musical Theresa. Pretty easy. I'm on Facebook too. So
that's awesome. And people can find the links in the show notes. I'll track those down and drop those in there so that they can stay in touch with you and read some of this research. And yes, they will hear this in time for that. So exciting. So that'll be great.
Awesome.
All right. Well, Theresa, thank you so much for spending an hour with me.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one at Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Choirlosophy checkout code. And of course, now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Choirlosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.